Hi, my name is Severin and I'm an interface and interaction designer. I've worked on various games on all kinds of platforms in the past years. As part of MyFOG 2013, a 6-week online event supporting young and passionate game designers to develop their first game, I'll talk about a small fraction of interface and interaction design and hope to motivate future game designers to take a deep interest in how to design human interfaces. We have 15 minutes together, so let's have a look at some of the most important interface and interaction design topics to make your game more user-friendly, accessible, and fun. Of course, 15 minutes are not enough to cover all relevant aspects of an interface or to explain them in detail, so check out some of the links below the video for further resources. Let's begin with something fundamental. Why should you care? Why is interface and interaction design important for game designers and developers? Interacting with your game should be challenging, diversified, and in the end fun. But struggling with poor controls and interface elements is not fun at all. A bad interface stands in the way of your game and the player. A poorly designed interface can corrupt the player's experience and lowers the potential of your game. That's why game designers care about the interface, to unfold the full potential of their game. What exactly is the interface? There are many definitions out there, so let's take a look at a more hands-on approach. Obviously, the GUI, the graphical user interface, is part of the interface. Buttons, labels, icons, text dialogues, and so forth are elements of the GUI. But there's more. The game world itself is an essential part of the interface as well. All game elements are there for a reason. They communicate game mechanics and dynamics to the player and should answer the following questions. Is the player able to see the difference between relevant game objects like platforms, obstacles, enemies, bullets, and the atmospheric background? Can he tell straight away whether approaching NPCs are friend or foe? To answer these questions, your game mechanics and dynamics need to be verified from an interface perspective. All these aspects influence the player's interaction with your game and hereby his experience with it. That's why interface and interaction design is an important part of the bigger topic user experience design, and of course game design itself. To know that everything the player or user can see, hear, and feel is part of the interface is the simplest but most profound understanding of interface and interaction design and is essential for designers of all professions. In the remaining minutes, I'll give you some best practice tips to draft and design a proper interface. Let's start by focusing on the visual aspects of your interface and the person who is looking at your game, the user. Be sensible about the fact that people are different. Even if you are the target audience of your game, and I hope you are, there is a huge difference between you and your player. You developed the game. He's playing it. So you know every detail and every aspect of your game, while the player doesn't. Your perspective at your game is totally different from the player's perspective. Try to get a deep understanding of the potential player. What games has he played? What expectations and previous experiences is he bringing along? Try to write 2 or 3 personas to put yourself in the player's shoes. Personas are incarnations of your target audience. Check out some online articles on how to write a persona or get the book About Face written by Alan Cooper. Show and test your game early and often, but don't lead the tester through your game. Let them play and observe closely what they do. Do they hesitate to interact at certain points? Do they miss tutorials or forget them quickly? After the session, ask them what specific interface elements mean, how they behave, and so on. You will get a lot of critical feedback. Cherish it. Treat any lack of understanding very seriously, because your future players don't want to feel clueless. They want to feel safe and in charge. Getting to know your player means getting to know his habits. Habits evolve over time under similar circumstances. To learn a new skill, people have to focus on the new task, blinding out the environment, and repeat that task till it turns into a habit. We as game developers and designers rely on our players' existing habits, because we want the player to be able to focus on the goal of the game, not its interface or its controls. So, if your interface or one of your controls is not already a habit to your audience, you have to help the player to develop the necessary habit through explanation and repetition. From then on, the player can concentrate on the game's goal without actively thinking about how to manage the interface or the controls. Our ability to correctly interpret icons, messages, feedback, and so on relies on our knowledge, in other words, on our habits. When we design interface elements like buttons, icons, menus, we tend to take for granted that everybody knows what they mean we tend to think that these elements are so obvious and their behavior so understandable. For us, they are, because we developed them, but not for the player. Providing explicitness through your game will raise its quality tremendously, and it's not too hard to achieve. Just use explicit text to label interface elements. Provide meaningful tooltips. Use words. Of course, it's not always easy to find a good-looking way to label everything, but you will figure it out. It's worth it. Be creative. Explain those elements beforehand, establish habits. The player will definitely appreciate your effort because with explicitly presented or introduced interface elements, he doesn't have to guess, he knows. And by knowing, he feels in control, which is one of the conditions to enjoy your game, to achieve flow. If you want to know more about flow and why it's necessary for games, check out Michael Csikszentmihalyi's talks and books. You will find the links below the video. Making interface elements explicit is one thing, but making them stand out is another. While focusing on one thing, like attacking multiple NPC enemies, people blend out everything else. They miss important information even if they are just centimeters away. To create perceptible interface elements, you have to make them really stick out. Use the fact that we react on movement and animate important messages or events. Let them jump or bounce so you can attract the player's attention. Show the player that his ammunition is nearly empty before he runs into the enemy pack he was so focused on. Use high contrast colors for your interface and check whether the GUI and other relevant game elements stand out on every background. Designing your interface or controls with explicitness and perceptibility in mind, your player's experience will improve significantly. During your first user or play tests, you will notice that most of the problems arise from explicitness or perceptibility issues. Use text, explain, repeat, make things big, and animate things. You will see the difference on the next test session. Another thing the user or player gets confused about is modality. As soon as the interface reacts unexpected, the player gets irritated and angry. With explicitness and perceptibility, you can help the user a lot, but that doesn't matter much if your interface is modal. But what does modality mean? Jeff Raskin, who worked on the Apple Macintosh in the late 70s and early 80s, explained the concept of modality very well in his book, The Human Interface. A mode occurs when a user input can have different system reaction based on the current system state. For example, if you click on a submit button in a web form, you expect the form to be sent and to receive a success screen. But what happens if it doesn't? When the same form appears on your screen with all your previously entered information, but you cannot see where the error is or whether there is an error at all, you get irritated. And irritation is never a good thing for an interface. A good designed web form shows you the missing fields right away before you hit the submit button, or it shows you the error on the reloaded screen in a perceptible and explicit way. So, the submit button is modal because it can have two different reactions on the user's click. In case A, everything works fine and the success screen appears. In case B, an error occurs and needs to be shown. Two possible reactions to one user input tells us that our interface is modal. Modal interfaces can cause great damage to the user experience and if not handled well, lead to frustration and perplexity on the user's side. But modal interfaces can be done well. Jeff Raskin called these good designed modes quasimodes, referring to the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Quasimodo. A quasimode is a mode which works for the user and does that in two possible ways: muzzle tension or focus of attention. What does that mean? If a mode is communicated by forcing the user to strain a muzzle, the user will not forget about the mode. He will always know a mode is present. Drag and drop is a very good example of a quasimode using muzzle tension to communicate the active mode. The Shift key on your keyboard is a good muzzle tension example too. You need to push and hold the key to write capital letters instead of lowercase letters. A good example for a quasimode using focus of attention instead of muzzle tension is the caps lock icon in password input fields. While the caps lock mode is active, you see a perceptible and mostly explicit icon close to your focus of attention, reminding you of the mode. This is a good way to communicate modal behavior, a quasimode. Let me give you an example for a poorly designed mode: the caps lock key itself. While writing documents, chat messages or similar text, you may have accidentally typed capital letters without knowing or remembering that the caps lock mode is active. That's because the mode button does not rely on muscle tension. It tries to communicate using focus of attention by showing you a small green light somewhere on the keyboard or the key itself. But where is your focus of attention when writing something? I guess on the screen, not on the keyboard. That's why so many people miss or forget that they have a mode activated and are irritated and frustrated when typing capital letters. They don't see the unflashy light on the keyboard. Their focus of attention is too far away. Even if it's just a matter of a few milliseconds, the interface leaves a bad impression. So if you need to communicate a mode using focus of attention, make sure your feedback is perceptible, explicit, and close to the user's focus of attention. But if you can, use muscle tension to communicate the mode because it's easier and more reliable. To clarify the importance of understanding and designing modes in a good way, let me show you a very famous modal game interface which is working fine, not only because you are used to them, but because it's designed well. Quasimodal, so to speak. Take any major ego shooter of the past years and think about the modes you are using constantly in that game. Which recurring action did you perform that can lead to different system reactions based on the system state? Yes, firing your gun is a modal action. Why? Because the system reacts differently based on your selected weapon. A pistol behaves differently from a rifle or a shotgun or a rocket launcher. This is a good designed mode, a quasi-mode. I'm sure you never, or very rarely, fired the wrong gun without knowing. That's the reason a major part of your screen is occupied by a 3D model of a gun, reacting to what you do, giving you feedback when firing, and so on. 3D models of all kinds of guns are an important part of the interface in shooters. It's not just eye candy. It serves an important role in understanding the game, in getting feedback, in providing a great user experience. The gun communicates the current mode, in other words weapon, close to your focus of attention. Big, bold, animated, and close to where you look. Of course, there are many other modal behaviors in shooters like crouching or aiming. Both of them are commonly communicated by muscle tension, holding down a specific key, and additionally are using the focus of attention by showing your gun sight or an icon. The previous two examples are very common, but they show how important it is that you train to discover modalities around you and of course in your game. The 3D gun in ego shooters shows how important interface and interaction design is to maintain a fun user experience, and that the interface is far more than the GUI. By taking the user's perspective seriously, trying hard to achieve an explicit, perceptible, and quasi-modal interface, and testing a lot, you will succeed in creating a more user-friendly interface, giving your game the ability to provide a user experience your players will be thankful for. Let's wrap up. The first small steps to a more accessible, user-friendly interface are explicitness and perceptibility. Perceptibility means that the player is able to perceive relevant information with one of the senses. If an interface element is not perceptible because it's too small, too silent, too far away, not animated, it is totally useless for the player. After an interface element is perceived, the player needs to understand the element. Explicitness is responsible to inform the player. Without explicitness, the player will misunderstand icons, buttons, gameplay mechanics, etc. Explicitness can be achieved by text, tooltips, prior explanation, and repetition. Remember, you are not the benchmark, the player is. I hope you enjoyed our short trip through the basics of interface and interaction design, and you got some ideas of how to improve your game. Check out the comments below this video for further links and books. And last but not least, have fun developing your first game.